start with an acknowledgement of country. Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting and pays respect to the elders past and present, and extends that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So everybody is all around Australia and maybe overseas right now, but I'm on the Coomberi land here on the Gold Coast, and very grateful to have the opportunity to do this presentation and host this seminar from there. Some general housekeeping. Please keep your microphone on mute so that we can avoid background noise. There will be time for questions at the end. Please use the chat and I will moderate the best I can. We may not get around to all questions because we do only have an hour in total. You can also put your hand up using that function and I can call on you. Please have your name, so make sure that your name is clear there so that we're aware of who we're talking to. And we ask that people use respectful and inclusive language. Abuse will not be tolerated in this forum. Just our Sport and Gender Equity Research Hub Twitter. Feel free to tweet during the seminar and the panel and include us so we can start to create more of a conversation about these issues and share some of the great ideas that people have. Okay, so many thanks for you all being here today. My name is Dr. Adele Pavlidis and I am convener of the SAGE Research Seminar Series. And I'm also a research fellow at Griffith University in the Griffith Centre for Social and Cultural Research. I'm currently funded by the Australian Research Council to work on a project focused on the rise of women's participation in contact sports and sports traditionally played by men. Part of this work is around shifting attitudes towards women, and as we know from extensive national and international research, attitudes towards women are one of the key drivers of violence towards women. We also know that we need to be thinking with an intersectional lens, as it's not only women who are the target of male violence in sport. And so we are here today to bring together a range of passionate, experienced, and brilliant people from industry, academic, and community backgrounds to hear their perspectives and hopefully help us learn a bit more. And more importantly, we might think of some new ideas for challenging attitudes that marginalize women and others and prevent violence in the cultural field of sport. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Indigo Willing, OAM, James Boland-Rudder, Anoushka Dowling, and Laura Giblett. Before we start our interactive session and Q&A, each panel is going to introduce themselves or their organisation and tell the audience a little bit about their work in this area. So I will now hand over, we'll go in order here, to Dr. Indigo Willing.
Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. After you stop sharing yours, Adele.
Oh yeah, that's what I need to do. That is why I can't hear myself.
Okay, I'm going to hopefully going to reduce that. Okay, so I also wish to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land and pay respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm based in Meanjin on the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagra peoples. So the influence of skateboarding is rapidly expanding. More than just a kid's toy and a youth culture, it is now an Olympic sport. It's also big business, achieving $1.9 billion in sales worldwide in 2018, with estimates at $2.5 billion in 2025. Skater Tony Hawk, for instance, has also generated $470 million in sales from his skate video games alone. Yet, like many sports and scenes dominated by boys and men, issues of sexism and sexual violence can go unchecked and pushed aside. As we shall see, the concept of rape culture is useful for thinking about these themes in the world of skateboarding, but also mainstream sports, as it emphasizes the socio-cultural dimensions of rape rather than proposing it's biologically inherent to men or any other gender. Researchers Keller et al. In 2018 explained that rape culture involves harmful practices, including rape jokes, sexual harassment, policing of the way that women dress, their appearance, their code of conduct, and victim blaming. Entitlement's another aspect, including the idea that sexual assault is not only seen as inevitable in some contexts, but desirable and excusable. And also where men feel confident that they can access women's bodies without fear of consequence, as Keller et al. State. Current social movements like Me Too, founded by Tarana Burke, a Black activist in the US, and work on sexual violence by a range of researchers also alert us to issues of intersectionality along lines of race, class, disabilities, genders, and sexualities. So now let's look at the history of skateboarding. As Professor Ian Borden in his historical study reveals, misogyny and a very macho culture has had a key influence. Feminist and gender studies by researchers such as Backstrom, Beale, Thorpe, Olive, Abu-Awa, Wheaton, Pavlidis, myself and more, confirm elements of sexism and problematic forms of masculinity have disempowered populations such as girls and women skaters. The samples in this slide are a little bit extreme, with the Enjoy ad saying where no means yes, and clearly scenes of domestic violence. But they offer clear evidence of rape culture in the past. And there's also the acquaintance rape that is shown graphically in the film Kids by Larry Clark, which I have a peer-reviewed article in the social science journal Young out later this year. A main paradox of this period in time was that while rape culture was clearly blatant, common beliefs and attitudes were that actual sexual harassment and sexual assaults were rare, done by extreme individuals like pro skater Mark Gator, who committed sexual homicide on his girlfriend's ex-flatmate and convicted and was sentenced to life. So in other words, it's something that doesn't really happen except for extreme examples. Now let's jump to the present. Thanks to pro skateboarders like Brian Anderson, who openly identifies as queer, non-binary skaters like Leo Baker, Black skaters in the Black Lives Movement, First Nation skaters, an increasing number of women, gender non-conforming, non-binary skaters, wheelchair MX and adaptive skateboarding, and more. The culture has actually shifted away from centering just cisgendered, white, non-disabled, and heterosexual men skaters. With this shift, issues of social justice have never been more emphasized and influential in skateboarding. Concurrently, issues such as rape culture have gone from being, to borrow from C. Wright Mill's sociological imagination, as a private trouble to being a public issue. We now have an emerging number of articles being written about sexual violence in skateboarding, to activists on social media calling out bad behaviors of abusers in their skate scene. I call this shift one from rape culture to consent culture. But what does change look like? Let me introduce you to Consent is Rad. Co-founded by me and other skateboarders from Queensland and around the world, our focus is on awareness and education. It's a calling in rather than calling out strategy that is growing in momentum. We feel it's effective for creating conversations and mobilizing calls to action, but it is by no means the only way to tackle rape culture and sexual violence. This is the launch at the skate conference Pushing Borders that was held last year in a high school that also teaches skateboarding. So directly connecting academics and youth together. In the other picture are some of my co-founders, Evie Ryder and Tora Waldron, and there are many others involved here and across the world from various backgrounds and identities. But having men, high-profile men in particular, and also people of all genders, is critical for us to reach the audiences we need to listen to our message. In one of the pics here, we have Bing Lui and Kia Johnson, who was nominated for an Academy Award for the skate film Minding the Gap, which tackles domestic violence. In the other picture is Rick McCrank, a pro skater who directed a documentary Abandoned and shown on Viceland, who has a huge audience and has 85,000 followers on his Instagram alone. So here are some of the challenges that exist in changing from rape cultures to cultures of consent in my scene of skateboarding, but no doubt many other spaces and places, from the police to the military to boardrooms to the AFL to NRL. So what do we have and where? Hegemonic masculinity, rape culture, lack of consent, the good guys don't rape myth, power, and structural limitations. Where? In things like the media, in our magazines, on social media, which is often very toxic, everyday banter and parlance like at the skate park, elite figures and celebrity skateboarders, and social spaces and leisure time, of which skateboarding is more than just the sport, it's also a lifestyle and a subculture, so things like parties, premieres, exhibitions, and tours. But what are some of the solutions? What would they look like? Firstly, we need more research funding and support as we are gaining momentum. Some of the ways is turning the language around. So from this shut up and skate to shut up and listen, silence is violence, listening is lit, show the bros, meaning get dudes that actually support consent visible, help from the heroes, mentors from various networks, democratizing spaces and the agency of survivors being elevated and highlighted, changing the social media, looking at things like restorative justice and from fields of criminology, and also drawing on existing research on sexual violence. There's so much that we need to learn, and we can be much stronger once we engage. And I'll be doing upcoming research projects with Adele Pavlidis and Professor Simone Fulliger and others in the near future on this with SAGE. So concluding, consent is a big issue and it can be very, very scaring and isolating, but we have to keep switching the script. No one is ever alone when doing this type of anti-violence work. There's existing work by many experts and people of all kinds of identities and backgrounds who won't mention in this talk due to time and scope, but I'm creating a list of scholars and groups on Twitter that already exist in Australia. I also welcome people to reach out after and to suggest more resources and ideas and to have honest conversations with me. We all need to keep refining the terminology, intellectual knowledge, and steps to being inclusive, especially for victims and survivors in and outside of academia, the sports sector, and anti-sexual violence activism. Here's some references. You can read this later. It's a bit intense. Hopefully I'll stop sharing my screen now. Thank you. Put my mic on mute.
Thanks so much, Indigo. That was fantastic to hear about that. And we'll hand over to James.
Thanks so much, Adele, and also thank you, Indigo, and for everybody joining today. My name is James Boland-Rudder, and I am the NRL's Head of Government and Community Relations. To start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I am today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. For most people, the NRL, if we're really frank, is entwined with this whole idea of that toxic masculinity, the problems that Indigo identified earlier in her talk on skateboarding. And I think a lot of those views are grounded in some of the history of our sport. And like most sports that have been traditionally viewed as male sports and high contact sports, there's a lot of work that is going on to ensure that those preconceptions are addressed and that we are part of a solution, part of the change that needs to take place across Australian culture. Not to say that we've got it right, but I think across all of those sports there are significant improvements being made and a lot of effort that's being made. So when I think about and talk about the NRL, I think about it in kind of two contexts. On one hand, we've got this entertainment product, the product that people tune into and watch of an evening, and we see ourselves very much as an entertainment business in that respect. We wouldn't think of, for example, the AFL being a competitor. We think of Netflix being a competitor. And so that entertainment side, and then on the other side of our business, we've got that traditional sports side, the way that most Australians engage with sport on a weekend, which is going down and having a run around on a football field or tennis court or going skateboarding, participating physically in some way. And so across those two streams, there's the ability for us to use our voice and also our contact to shape and influence. So on the entertainment side, each weekend we have about 4 million people cumulatively tune into our content, or for some of our major events, so like a State of Origin or a Grand Final Day, we'll have 4 million people tune in for that single event, and that's just within Australia. And so when we think about those pinnacle moments, those entertainment moments, what can we think about, well, what can we do to positively shape and influence? And it's been kind of twofold in that respect as well. There's been, how do we utilize the men's competition to influence? And we've done some what some people would consider radical things. Others would consider this as us being responsible citizens and using our voice. So there was an Australia versus New Zealand test match a couple of years ago. And in rugby league, the best seats in the house are those on halfway. and we covered 72 seats on the halfway line with white covers to acknowledge the 72 women who had lost their lives to domestic violence in the preceding 12 months. That measure was applauded by some, it was denigrated by others for sport delving into a political issue. But what it did was stimulate a really important discussion, and that's the kind of thing we can do through our entertainment product. We can use these pinnacle moments to stimulate a discussion and stimulate a debate. And then on the other side is making sure on the entertainment product side that there is equal opportunity for our male athletes and our female athletes. Now, there is a hell of a long way to go in that, don't get me wrong. And some sports have done it better than us. Some sports are on a similar journey, and people have taken different approaches. We're really proud of the fact that we do have an NRL women's competition as well as the men's competition. The women's competition is smaller, and that was actually, it's been criticised for being smaller, but it was a considered decision from discussions with a lot of our female athletes who thought, if we're about an entertainment product, people tune in to be entertained, and therefore they want a really high quality entertainment product. And the talent pool, the talent depth, because of structural deficiencies that we had historically, just isn't there. And so we've had to narrow the scope of that competition to just being 4 teams as we build out the talent pool by addressing those structural challenges and making sure there are the same pathway opportunities for male and female athletes. And from that platform we'll grow. And what we've seen through broadcast numbers, which is your measure of success on the entertainment side, is that Australians are willing to tune into really entertaining women's sport. Like our Women's State of Origin match last year had 1.5 million viewers, which outranks, Married at First Sight, Bachelor, all those reality TV programs that are considered as being kind of the leaders. Actually, women's sport was one of the leaders, which I think we should all be really proud of. That was the most watched women's sports program in the country. Long way to go, but there's work being done. And then on the other side, as I said, there's the grassroots programming. And the twofold challenge there is, how do we make sure that there are the same opportunities for girls and boys? Historically, the girls were told between the ages of 12 and 18, they weren't allowed to play, and that's just wrong. And so through the good work of our state-based leagues who are responsible for the grassroots competition, they've invested heavily in making sure that there are competitions now for girls alongside boys from the ages of 12 through 18 as well. And then because of the makeup of our sport and the history of it, the sport is predominantly played by males. About 80% of our participants are males. So we've got this huge group of young men that we can have conversations with to positively influence their attitudes, positively influence the way that they approach gender, and hopefully educate them not just to be better football players, but more importantly, better people, better citizens who are respectful. And in doing that, we really do believe that we will be able to help have an impact on the unacceptably high rates of violence, not only here in Australia, but also across the Pacific, where we do a lot of work with through partnerships with BFAT and local organisations as well. So that's kind of what we do at an NRL level. We are far from perfect, don't get me wrong, but hopefully we are on the right track and the track that many others.
Thanks so much, James. And now I will hand over to Laura. Was next on my list.
Wonderful, thank you. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on down here in Melbourne. It's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. So hi everyone, lovely to be here. My name's Laura Giblett. I currently work, I have two roles. One is in safeguarding at the YMCA, and the other is at Our Watch as their senior advisor in sports. So I actually moved down to Melbourne at the start of this year. I thought I'd move to the sporting capital of the world for a bit of a change, and here I am stuck in my apartment, not able to go anywhere. So it's been a journey, but along this way, I'm very fortunate to get the job with Our Watch. And I guess my background before that was working for Rugby Australia, which is another NSO, or National Sporting Organisation, for those that don't know sport language. I was there for 5 years, and in that time was lucky enough to manage the Our Watch partnership. So Our Watch actually started with sport back in 2015, I think it was, partnering with 4 big NSOs. They were the NRL, Rugby Australia, Netball Australia, and the AFL. So we've kind of been through 2 programs with Our Watch. There was NSO Engagement Program 1, and then there was also NSO Engagement Program 2, which saw the introduction of FFA as well into that fold. And really that work involved partnering with NSOs to build their capacity in understanding the drivers of violence against women and the role that sport could play. And I think just echoing what James has already said, and Indigo as well, so much potential to shift some of those harmful attitudes and behaviours. And we've seen some really great work be done across those years. So for example, in the NRL, as James was saying, lots of work done in the professional game, but also their Voice Against Violence program, a community program we've seen and helped the development with, which has been amazing. And that's gone overseas as well into the Pacific. We've seen multiple e-learning courses and programs developed. To think of a few, like AFL have Respectful Relationships, a program. I know Rugby Australia have a bystander online program as well. Lots of training with staff and players. So as part of those NSO programs, all staff and some players had to go through Change the Story training as well. And from that, we actually got a lot of player ambassadors, which Our Watch still has with the AFL and with NRL as well, which we see as a really important part in, I guess, that role modeling behaviour, but also in the influence that they have in their communities as well, and with the fans and spectators. So that's been a real kind of legacy piece out of those programs as well. And we were also lucky enough to contribute to organisational gender equality strategies and action plans. So Our Watch have had a real, I guess, touch point with those 4 or 5 NSOs over the last couple of years, and we're definitely still continuing the work. So what we're kind of looking at now is we still engage the NSOs in a community of practice forum, which has been great. And we're actually about to launch a similar model for a specific program involving sports journalists, which will be amazing, and hopefully combine the work we've already done with the media program in media making change and the work that we've done with the sports program. So combining the two. So that will be really exciting and kicking off later this year. And then the other thing, finally, later in the year, Our Watch will also be launching a dedicated sports website with our Equality and Respect in Sport resource really being, I guess, the centerpiece of that. And what we're hoping to do is expand our scope and expand our reach with other sports who may not have been involved in those funded programming before. And in doing that, we will expand our reach, and sport will expand our reach as well, because we know there's a lot of layers of influence we haven't been able to get yet. So it'll be great to continue our work with those key NSOs, but also hopefully invite others in. And we may even be looking to a bit more what we can do in clubland and really support some clubs to be able to do this work as well. I guess that's just a bit of a snapshot of what we've done to date. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. And then finally, Anoushka from MATES.
Hi everyone, my name's Anoushka. I'm the Assistant Director of the MATE Bystander Program here at Griffith University. I am also sitting here on the land of the Kumbamerri saltwater people, and I would like to acknowledge their deep spiritual connection to this land before we go forward. I won't take up too much time, but I will let you know a little bit about the MATE Bystander Program. We are a bystander focused program. So we really work on identifying the link between gender inequality and gender-based violence, and empowering people as bystanders in the community to first recognise problematic behaviour, and all the way, everything from overt forms of violence to more covert problematic behaviour. We give them the tools and the strategies to intervene appropriately and respectfully and safely in all forms of violence, while also recognising the ways that we all in some way contribute to a culture that supports violence, how we can more so consciously contribute more positively to society to ensure that we are challenging instances of problematic behaviour and abuse. What we really want to do, what our focus is to empower people in all levels of society to recognise their personal leadership and their ability to contribute positively in all facets of their life. So in order to do that, they need to be able to recognise where gender inequality sits, and how they can positively interact, which is why we really love the sport conversation. We talk about gender inequity in sport being on a continuum of gender-based violence, and how sport has a really huge capacity to influence society. So having this conversation is really important. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Anoushka. And people can start to put their questions in comments when they're ready. But I just, it's hard to know where to start, but I just thought start by acknowledging that this is not a new issue. We've had a long history of issues to do with masculinity and violence in sport, or the link between hegemonic masculinity in sport and violence. So, and we've had a lot of education, a lot of different programs, and this is violence sometimes on the field with assaults, also in locker rooms, and then at other spaces after the game. I just wanted to, start with this question. What do you think is getting in the way of meaningful actions or changes that can help prevent violence? I mean, why do we continue to see young players being the perpetrators of violence? Who would like to start? I can just, maybe we could start with Laura.
Sure, that's fine. So what's getting in the way? I think at our watch especially, we talk about making change in the places we work, live and play, and sport is one of them. Sport, I guess, showcases really a cross-section of society. So whilst at times we see this play out in sport, really this is a societal issue that we're seeing, and sport is the platform that it's playing out on, I suppose. And I think, well, why is it happening? We still know that there's harmful attitudes and behaviours in society, and we know that we've got a long way to go. And I think sport is really just that, yeah, as I said, the area that it's kind of playing out. And I guess at times, as James alluded to, that platform and that influence that it has is quite big. And so when something does happen in sport, that can be amplified, and it does reach the media, and there's lots of high-profile people involved, and there's lots of money at stake as well. So I think it's a societal issue that's playing out somewhere, and I guess that's why it's so important to have sport involved in this work, because we know that it's a societal issue, and sport is such a big part of the Australian culture for many reasons.
Thanks, Laura. Did anyone else want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I just echo what Laura was saying there. For all of the benefits that big sports have, we've got a very big voice in the Australian community. So in New South Wales and Queensland, rugby league is on the front or back page of the Courier Mail or Daily Telegraph, literally every second day. And so a huge voice, which can be used for the positive and positively influence discussion and conversation, but also it comes with the negative. And so whenever a player misbehaves, their indiscretions, their misbehaviour, their criminal activities are splashed all across the news. And to be honest, that does not happen in many other industries. And so we have, yes, we do have issues, we do have problems, and we have a responsibility to act swiftly against those. And you know, we've seen it with the AFL last week with the images that came out of you know, the strange behaviour, to be honest, in the change rooms. We took some pretty drastic action last year when we introduced a rule called the no fault stand down rule, which means that if a player, an NRL player, is charged with a serious crime, so a crime that carries 11 years or more sentence from the criminal courts, and the CEO also has the discretion to use the rule in instances of other sexual assault crimes or other crimes against women and children predominantly, to actually stand down that player. They are not allowed to participate in the competition whilst waiting for the court proceedings to be complete. And so that rule's pretty drastic, but it sends a very strong message to a player base who are looked upon as heroes, as idols, whether they want to be or not. It sends a very strong message that these kind of activities, this kind of behaviour is just not acceptable, whether it be in our sport or it's also just not acceptable to the community that we all want to be part of and live in. So it's taking a whole series of measures to gradually change attitudes, change behaviours, and also acknowledge the role that sport has in shaping that through the big voice that we all have.
Yeah.
Sorry, Adele.
Anoushka.
I just wanted to really quickly touch on that, and the attitudes is a really big one when we're talking about what's standing in the way. And attitudes are really a result of deeply ingrained social norms, entrenched ideas about tradition, and also rigid gender stereotypes. And those attitudes are a result of all of those things. Our attitudes drive our behaviour. So when we're talking about what's standing in the way, we have to look at all of those things, particularly the social and cultural norms, not just in society, but also in that really magnified environment of sport.
Yeah, so much to talk about, but we'll give some time to some of the participants. So Shauna Marks has a question, and then after that will be Catherine Palmer. So Shauna.
Hi everyone. So my PhD is about how we conceptualise masculinity, sex and sexual violence in the context of amateur Australian football. So what I've been really focused on, especially lately as I'm finalising the work, is about how communities form around sport and how communities respond to sexual violence in particular, but you could use it for any kind of form of violence. So what I want to know from the participants in the panel is how can we conceptualize the whole sport community in a way that is going to allow us to tackle sexual violence and how it's perpetuated within a large sport culture, but at localized levels. Does that make sense?
I'm happy to try.
Thanks, Laura.
I'm sure others will have some great input too. It's a great question, and something that we learned from the NSO programs was that this can't be done in isolation. So we talk about a whole of sport approach, and that is everybody. So that's administrators, board directors, referees, players, fans, spectators, all the way down to community. And I think the approach does have to be slightly different for all of those. So we've really worked with the NSOs and really kind of in the sports administrators space. So thinking of them as a workplace, but then also the players and trying to tap onto their level of influence, I suppose, as I mentioned before. But it is a big piece of work. And I think I'd be keen to hear from James actually on the NRL Voice Against Violence program is a great example of that. So that's taking the players and their role and I guess their kind of high profile aspect into the community, into clubs, and actually teaching at the grassroots level. And I'm sure there's been some great learnings out of that as well. But I think that's kind of, when you talk about the masculinity piece, it's really trying to challenge that and really trying to bring that into the conversation at a young level and using, tough footy blokes as the person to deliver that message, which has been a great aspect of that program.
Thanks, Laura. I was going to say, I think the Voice Against Violence program that we're lucky enough to run in Australia, but also across the Pacific, is a really good example of being able to affect behavioural change at a localised level. So the way the program works is we get current or former NRL players to go in and deliver what most of the boys think is going to be a training session that's targeted to boys from about 15 through 17. And they think they're signing up to learn all these new NRL training drills from a superstar player, and they're going to become a better NRL player. What we've done in partnership with Our Watch and also in partnership with Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia is overlay all the training drill with messages about domestic violence. So educating them on the prevalence of domestic violence in our community, the different forms of violence, educating the boys on what they can do as bystanders and their role as bystanders, what they can do if they feel violent tendencies or if they have been perpetrators, because it'd be naive of any of us to think that there's not perpetrators in and amongst our workforces, in amongst our sporting groups. So by integrating these messages in and through training drills, the beauty of training is that you do the same training drill every week, and so therefore by repetition it's being drilled into these boys, to these young men, their roles in the community, their responsibilities within the community, and affecting behavioural change. One of the most powerful images I saw through this program was being up in PNG once, and I saw that I think Joanna Lester is on this here as well, and she's done a lot of work up in PNG as well with rugby league. Made a really great documentary that I'd commend it to everyone to watch, called Power Mary, which highlights the importance of sport changing the attitudes towards women in the most violent country in the world. So this program we were delivering to a group of men who'd formed a football team in jail. They'd come out of jail and continued on their football team, and they are violent, hard men. And delivered this program with Alan Tung, who used to captain the Raiders team. And then the next day we were driving by this same town and we saw those men actually teaching that program to other boys in their community. And so you could see that whilst we often think of idols in football as being these superstars, actually there's this generational piece. If we can get these younger men then teaching boys, younger men again, and transferring that knowledge, then hopefully we will continue to see a shift in attitudes.
I'll move on to Catherine Palmer's got a couple of questions. Did you want to choose just one, Catherine? Because we don't have much time.
Sure. Okay, I will choose playing favourites. So I will choose Laura. And Laura, does any of your Change the Story work address alcohol?
Oh, okay. So it's okay. I'll just Change the Story is the evidence-based framework that Our Watch uses, if anybody isn't familiar with it. And alcohol and drugs is mentioned in there more around aggravating factors. Yep. So when we talk about, especially when I've done this with sport, actually, it is an important part to address, because there are some myths and misconceptions out there that violence against women and children can be perpetrated by people under the influence, which we do know does happen, but it is not the main driver. And that's the message that's really reinforced in the Change the Story framework. So gender inequality is the main driver, but we do acknowledge there are aggravating factors. That's where we address them and Change the Story.
Cool. Thank you.
Simone has got a question next. Do you want to ask it, Simone?
Sure, I just wrote it up there so it's easy for people to see, but really it's a question about all this great work that's been happening around cultural change and changing attitudes towards women and also non-binary participants. But how do we think about the bigger picture that I think Laura's touched on, and our watch does a lot of work in this space, is thinking about the structural changes in sport organisations, getting more women into decision-making roles, leadership, coaching men's teams as well, and more investment in the women's competition. So we are seeing, you know, a more equal representation of women's capacities in the public sphere. It's an open question to the panel.
I think it's a great question. And one of the most confronting things our executive team ever did was sit down with our watch, and we did a session that looked at our workforce, that looked at the content that's produced on our website, and also on looked at kind of our overall player numbers across the broader participation base, and it just showed how skewed, despite all the work that's gone on, we still are. There was a call out made, I think, on the website that day that despite it being 2 weeks out from the NRLW competition, there were 2 articles that appeared featuring women. One of them featured Jacinda Ardern and some of the work that we'd done with Jacinda over in New Zealand. And then the other was featuring one of our female referees. So having those really confronting conversations and being challenged by external parties like Our Watch, who are a great partner, but also great at pointing out where you need to improve, I think is going to help and continue to drive change. The other great experience we've had is in Victoria, the quote, I think it's you need 40% of your board positions to be filled by females in order to receive government funding. Driven so much change, not only in our sport, but across all the sports down there. And so, you know, I think, and Victoria, through the establishment with Bridie O'Donnell of the Women's Sport Office, has also really helped drive that structural change. The thing about structural change that we find, that I reflect on, is that it is slow. So it's not as probably quick as most of us would want to see, but it is occurring.
Thanks. Indigo, did you have a response to that question as well from the skateboarding perspective?
Thank you, Adele, and thank you for the question. And just really interesting to reflect on the more established organisations such as James and Our Watch and Mate Bystander. But I guess where I can speak from is a more grassroots level approach to structural change. And a lot of skateboarding culture, how it differs from mainstream sport is that it's got a very do-it-yourself culture. So a lot of the way the culture is shaped is in the hands of the skaters themselves, and the corporations sort of follow what's exciting, they follow the dollar in a sense. So the reason I mentioned all the diversity that is happening in skateboarding, from non-binary skaters, queer skateboarding and so on, is that many of these skaters are challenging so much of the behaviour that has been harmful in the past, and making their own zines, bringing out music, holding their own concerts, holding marches. So one of the biggest sort of, Black Lives Matters marches in Chicago, which had thousands of skateboarders and cyclists, was organised by a feminist skateboarding group. So these skateboarders are very, very good at shaping their own culture. And so what they're doing really is saying, this is what we want to see, and no one's going to help us because we don't have any formal board, so we're just going to build it. And then people appeal, it's very appealing, and they join it. So a really great example is that Nike is a very big corporation who has signed non-binary skater Leo Baker, and sort of Tony Hawk, who makes those video games that reach $470 million in sales. Tony Hawk has put Leo Baker in that game, and the language itself in the game is changing. There have been all these offensive terms that the skaters use. That language is shifting because of these, very influential figures that are just saying enough is enough. So yeah, sort of not just looking top down, but from the ground up, being led by these grassroots changes. And a lot of people, when you have very famous celebrities that do something wrong, it's a little abstract. It's like, yeah, they've changed, so what? But if you have local stores, if you have local competitions and people stop going because it's like, no, the attitude there is toxic, it's not very welcoming, that has an immediate impact. So really sort of using that sort of people power, I guess. I don't know if that answers it, but that's the structural change from below.
Yeah, thanks. There's actually a question here from Chalak to, would you like to ask your question? Otherwise, I can ask it. So it's again for Indigo. He asked, what kind of differences do you see in mainstream sport and extreme sport in cases of sexual abuses or sexual abuse?
So I'll be very brief because I answered a little bit in the past, but a very good example is a high-profile skateboarding coach that was accused of sexual abuse and sexual violence against a minor. And a company, they're quite a legendary figure, and a company was bringing out a board to commemorate them. But the community on Instagram really put pressure on that, saying, you know, this is just not appropriate. It's not the right time. You know, investigate by all means, but we should not be holding up these people while they're being investigated about these types of things. And so that board was removed. So really just, you know, looking at social media and looking at what is quite a young culture as well, and the ways that they want to change things can be, you know, really great. They've bypassed safe sports and all the formal organizations that are there to safeguard athletes, and are just doing it themselves. So I guess that is the freedom of not being so restricted by formal organizations. On the other hand, it would be great if it could be a combination. So thank you for that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Indigo. There's a question from Orieli. Would you like to ask?
You did well. Yeah, sure. I'm just going to turn on my video. First, I'd like to thank Sage for organizing this great panel. I think it's a very important discussion to have for all of us, and the panelists as well. I think I think my question has been answered in some ways, and just now by Indigo. A lot of the discussion has been around how sport programs and products, like in rugby, can be leveraged to educate on violence against women and girls more broadly in society. And I guess my question was more on the fact that we know that perpetrators like Coach, as Indigo mentioned, of violence are also within sports. And I was wondering if you had thoughts about how these prevention efforts can be used to protect women and girls who play in sports. So it's for the whole panel.
I'm happy to try again. Oh, there you go, James.
No, you go, Laura. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure I'll probably pass to you anyway. It's a great question, and we have actually thought of this as well from the NSO perspective. When you do all this work and you do all this training with people and you get them up to speed and you're ready to implement, and then people leave or people go, and then you've got to kind of bring the next person into the fold. And I'm sure that happens all the way down at grassroots as well. People change, people, you know, need to be kind of brought up to speed on what things are. So how do we get sport to really be kind of, this is what we're about here, this is what we do here, and you know, that behavior is not going to fly. That's the kind of I guess messaging we talk to when we spot, particularly in clubs I'm talking, not so much the NSOs. But I think it's really trying to get that values-based organisation as well. So when we do this work, we talk about this from a values perspective as well. We adopt, as I mentioned before, the whole of sport approach. So we're not trying to do things in isolation. We need to bring everybody in, and everybody needs to be on the same page. So it's not left up to one or two people to drive this work, because one, it's hard work and there's burnout, and two, you can't do it alone. And we're really trying to do that with the sports so the community of practice forum's a great example, but we need to do more, and we're stronger if we do it together. And we're stronger if we work together. As James mentioned before, sports may, I keep saying we, sorry, because I used to work in a sport, but not anymore. They may butt heads on other things around broadcasting and things like that. But when it comes to this, it's everyone's issue, and we all need to work together. And I think sport generally has really adopted that really well, and we want to make change and we want to do things together, and we know that we're stronger if we do that together.
I just wanted to comment on that question as well, just in regards to the culture of sport at times being, quite harsh or tough, and the way that it maybe allows perpetrators to, have a particular kind of way of being with the athletes. But also, as we talked about earlier, in shifting attitudes, I would have thought that we need to start really young in, when the children are young, like that maybe the investment in training, in really great policies, in really challenging gender norms needs to happen in those earlier years, because if we want to start change, we need to start, all the way through. And maybe sometimes those kind of, because, kids might only go to training once a week and it's not that serious, there's not as much investment. Is there much investment in the early years in trying to kind of challenge attitudes, maybe with parents as well? I don't know, is much being done in that area? Do panelists know?
I can speak to it from our sports perspective. So we do a lot of work, and it's been driven by research in coach education. What we've found is that the number one reason for a child not of dropping out of sport, I guess, is a poor experience with a coach. And so in that respect, it's a prudent investment, and there's a strong component of all the coach education. This hasn't been done historically, but it is done now, is focused on gender equality, and being mindful of language, being mindful of actions, and being that good example. And by educating the coach, I guess it goes to what a lot of Anoushka's program is about as well, is they're a leader who then sets the culture and changes the culture in that sporting team or in that work environment. So hopefully that the education that we give to our coaching staff will then help influence the children that are playing not only rugby league but all sports at quite a young age. The other comment I just wanted to quickly make in relation to that question earlier was we've been delivering our Voice Against Violence program in the Pacific to women's teams as well. And what we found, a modified version of it, what we found really interesting is the need to educate women, especially in the Pacific, on the different forms of violence and what is okay and what's not okay. I just reflect on a session again up in Papua New Guinea where we were having some, pretty confronting and challenging conversations about notions like a bride price, and this idea that once a man's paid a bride price, that basically gives him an entitlement over the woman, and how that's been embedded into some parts of culture up there. So using sport as a vehicle to not only educate and change the attitudes and views of young men, but also educating female athletes on behaviours and practices that they may think is completely normal, may think is okay, and kind of challenging those concepts, challenging those ideas, and using sport as a vehicle to have those conversations and educate those young women so that they're better equipped as well to help address the challenges that are especially prominent in the Pacific.
Thanks. There's a question from Tim here, just about, are you aware of any video resources of examples of bystander activity? We're running out of time, but I thought Anoushka or Laura might have some resources and we can share them on our Twitter feed or in the comments here. And the next question is from Alicia. Alicia, would you like to ask your question, or I can, if you like?
Thanks, Adele. It's probably partially been answered in talking about how do we start this with kids, but as someone that's been involved in sport all of my life, I haven't really necessarily been exposed to the conversations about the role that sport and women's roles in sport and women as coaches and in leadership positions can play into the broader issue of violence against women. So we're all kind of in the conversation here preaching to the converted, and it's people who are aware and have the information and the understanding, and they, you know, you can quote the statistics, but how do we get this conversation out into mainstream clubs and community groups and local councils and other sort of peak bodies, so that we're not just having this conversation with people that understand about it, but get it into the conversation more broadly?
Really,
for anyone who would like to answer.
I can have a go at that, Adele, if you
great.
like. I think education is key. James just touched on that, and as has Laura and Indigo, as we've been hearing. I mean, education is key. Promoting the conversation, sharing the resources. I would love to see, and this probably goes back to the other point as well, the previous point. I'd love to see that all of the education that's given in sporting organisations with young people in particular is shared at home with parents. If some of the resources can then be taken home to parents around what is acceptable behaviour, what the expectations are and how they're going to be enforced, or how people are going to be held accountable, including parents on the sidelines. I would love to see that being shared as a part of a whole sport approach. And yeah, I think just really having the conversation, it's really a shame to hear that you've been part of sport for so long and have only just kind of been made aware of the importance of equity in sport and the issues surrounding violence against women being magnified in sporting environments. So the more that we can have the conversation, the more that we are seeing women in leadership positions.
I think Anoushka's just cut out, but I wanted to actually talk about that question, Alicia, in terms of having more gender equity on the agenda at the very top levels of sport as well, and at a club level and at a community level, and shifting the criteria for maybe what a leader in sport needs to have, what capacities they have, to therefore open up those positions to a more diverse range of people. So rather than simply having I guess a succession plan of people that just, you know, have the same kind of background and the same values, just shifting it up a little. I mean, I think it's worth it. I know that, you know, there will be a risk in doing that, but that could be a way in actually creating change. It is 10:59, and unfortunately we cannot get to all the questions as we knew that we wouldn't. But I want to just take this opportunity to thank everyone. These conversations will continue, and hopefully, you know, this is a lifetime's worth of work, or 10 lifetimes. This is not, you know, something that we can change in a seminar, but it's just really good to highlight it today. And I will hand it over now to, would anybody like to have any final remarks before we finish up?
The only thing I would say is if anybody does want to reach out, please feel free to, because I know sport is such a big sector as well, and we've worked with key organisations, but we would love to hear from others as well. So if you are unsure, please do reach out, and we can do our best to link you in with others that we may know as well.
Thanks, Laura.
I'm not sure if everyone saw that Joanna Lester sent around a link to her film, Power Mary. Rather than watching something on Netflix tonight, do yourselves a favour, watch that doco. It's incredible and shows how powerful sport can be in changing attitudes.
Thanks. I will now hand over to Simone, who will just wrap us up, and we have a save the date for next month.
Great. Thank you very much, Adele, for chairing the session, and to our fantastic panellists, Anoushka, James, Laura and Indigo, and Kim behind the scenes for organising today. Fantastic ideas and really good comments on the chat as well, and resources being shared. So Thank you to everyone for participating. I think we had 98 people join us today, which is fantastic, from all areas of sport. And we really encourage those conversations to continue in your own organisations. Today's seminar was linked to Griffith's It's On All of Us Safe Campuses initiative. So we wanted to kind of link it into broader activities happening at Griffith. And it's something that we can do in all of our organisations. So I encourage you to do that. And also just to say that we did actually show the Power Mary film when we launched our new Sage website. And that was a fantastic film, so do highly recommend it. So join us in September for our next seminar, quite a different focus. But again, these issues that we started to talk about through our seminar series continue on, and they all intersect. So thanks everyone again, and we look forward to talking with you next seminar. Bye.